Hey everyone, welcome back. Sometimes I think the coolest stuff in history is hidden in plain sight, like that weird stain on the carpet that turns out to be like a 17th century love letter or something. But in our case, it's a Welsh bishop named Cyfeilliog. I'm Hari, and I'm ready to unravel this historical enigma.
I'm Kimi, and I can already tell you Cyfeilliog's story is one of those footnotes that explodes into a whole chapter once you start digging.
Okay, so let's set the stage, shall we? We're talking 9th century Wales, which I guess you might imagine as like rolling green hills and maybe a dragon or two. But it was actually a seriously intense time.
Definitely imagine a patchwork of kingdoms, each vying for power. Gwent glywizing, all trying to hold their own against the mighty Mercia to the east, with Viking raiders adding a whole other level of chaos. It's a bit like that game of Risk where everyone's eyeing your
And
territories.
smack dab in the middle of this is Cyfeilliog, a man whose name is like catnip to history nerds because it's mentioned in these scattered sources, charters, land grants, and one super cryptic note in a poetry collection.
And to make things even more intriguing, one of those sources tells us he was captured by Vikings in 914. Talk about a bad day at the office.
Right. You think your commute is rough. Imagine getting kidnapped by Vikings. But here's the kicker. It wasn't even a Welsh king who paid his ransom. It was the Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Elder, who forked over 40 pounds of silver, a king's ransom in those days.
Yeah, that one detail tells you a lot about the power dynamics at play. It suggests Edward saw Cyfeilliog as valuable enough to intervene, perhaps, as a way to project Anglo-Saxon influence into Wales.
Speaking of things that are valuable and mysterious,
Yeah.
let's talk about that poetry collection, the Juvencus manuscript.
Yeah.
But this book is ancient and important all on its own. But Cyfeilliog didn't just doodle in the margins, he left a coded message, a full-on cryptogram.
And not just any code. He used Greek numerals to replace Latin letters, which was actually a clever trick borrowed from Irish scholars, highlighting the intellectual connections crisscrossing the Irish Sea. It's like finding a secret message in a bottle, except the bottle is a 1,000-year-old book.
So once they cracked the code, what they found was a prayer request from Cyfeilliog. Not exactly the earth-shattering secret we were hoping for, but still pretty cool.
It does raise an interesting point, though. If he was familiar with this Irish code, perhaps he spent time at Llantwit, a major center of learning with strong ties to Ireland, maybe even as an abbot, before becoming a bishop.
So we have this bishop who was captured by Vikings, ransomed by an Anglo-Saxon king, and left secret messages in ancient poetry collections.
Sure.
But what about his actual job as a bishop? What do we know about that? Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2025 Su 105, part 2 of 3.
Well, to understand Cyfeilliog's role as a bishop, we need to delve into those historical records you mentioned earlier, the charters, land grants, and legal documents that offer glimpses into his daily life.
And you know me, I love a good historical deep dive. What kind of things did a bishop actually do in 9th century Wales? Was it all just like preaching and praying, or was there more to it?
Oh, it was far more than that. Bishops were powerful figures in early medieval society. They held large estates, wielded political influence, and were often involved in legal disputes, kind of like a religious version of a feudal lord.
So not just a man of the cloth, but a man of the court as well. Our Cyfeilliog was the busy guy. What kind of juicy details do these records reveal about his activities?
Well, for instance, we have records of Cyfeilliog butting heads with King Braffael of Gwent. And get this, in one case, Cyfeilliog was awarded something called an insult price in pure gold for an offense against him and his household.
Hold on, an insult price. Did people just like go around insulting each other and demanding payment? That sounds like a great way to make a living.
Not quite. It's actually a fascinating concept called wine-up-worth, which basically means face worth, reflecting the idea that a person's social standing determined their value and therefore the compensation for any offense against them. So insulting a bishop was a lot more expensive than insulting a peasant.
So it's all about social hierarchy. Makes sense. I guess in those days, reputation was everything. But aside from demanding his due respect, what other bishoply duties was Cyfeilliog up to?
From what we can gather, he was quite active in acquiring and managing land, likely to support the church and its various functions. For example, King Hywel ap Rhys of Glywysing, a neighboring ruler, granted him 2 slaves and their future offspring for the benefit of Hywel's family souls. Talk about a lasting legacy.
Wow, slaves as a donation to the church. That's definitely a different world. But it does highlight how religion permeated every aspect of life back then, even economic transactions. But getting back to Cyfeilliog's territory, there's this debate about the size and location of his diocese, right? Some sources place him in a small area around Caerwent, while others suggest he had influence over a much larger region.
Exactly. And this discrepancy might reflect the turbulent nature of the time. Remember, borders were far more fluid back then, and Cyfeilliog's authority likely shifted as alliances changed and power dynamics ebbed and flowed.
So it wasn't just a case of like, this is my land and that's yours. His diocese could have expanded or shrunk depending on who was in charge and who was allied with whom. It's like a game of political chess with bishops as the pieces.
That's a great analogy. And it's worth noting that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to him as Bishop of Archenfield, with Archenfield being the English name for Urging, an area that stretched into what's now Herefordshire in England.
So not only was he navigating the complex world of Welsh politics, but he was also dealing with Anglo-Saxon influence. This Cyfeilliog was really at the crossroads of multiple cultures and kingdoms. But wait, I remember you mentioned something earlier about a final intriguing detail, something that raises more questions than answers. Are you ready to drop that bombshell on us? Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2025-0105, part 3 of 3. You give me with it. What's this final twist in the tale of Cyfeilliog? I'm on the edge of my seat.
Well, it all comes down to the Book of Llandaff, a 12th century manuscript that tries to trace like a continuous line of bishops in southeastern Wales all the way back to the 5th century. And guess who makes an appearance?
Let me guess, our main man, Cyfeilliog. But hold on a sec. A continuous line of bishops for 7 centuries. That sounds a bit too perfect, especially with all the craziness and upheaval we've been talking about.
You got it. You're spot on. Most historians see this as the Llandaff diocese basically trying to pump up its own prestige and legitimacy, like they're rewriting history to make themselves look like the big dogs, the top religious power in the region. It's like someone saying, oh yeah, my family goes all the way back to King Arthur. Impressive if it's true, but probably a bit of a stretch.
So it's less about historical accuracy and more about flexing their authority. A bit of 12th century fake news. I guess some things never change. But where does Cyfeilliog fit into all of this?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Even though the Book of Llandaff tries to shove him into this grand lineage of bishops, the actual evidence from his time suggests his bishopric was much smaller, more focused on Gwent, and not the massive territory the book claims for Llandaff.
So it's like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want Cyfeilliog as part of their legacy, but they conveniently ignore the fact that his real area of influence doesn't fit their story.
Exactly. It just goes to show that you can't always take historical sources at face value. We always got to think about who wrote them, when they wrote them, and what their agenda might have been. Sometimes what looks like a straightforward account is actually a carefully crafted PR spin.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just a bunch of facts. It's a story told from a specific point of view. And sometimes that point of view is trying to sell you something. But hey, that's what makes history so fascinating, right? We get to piece together these little bits and pieces, sift through the biases, and try to understand the past on its own terms.
Absolutely. And I think Cyfeilliog's story is a perfect example of that. His life pieced together from these scattered records and a bit of code breaking shows us just how complex and interconnected the early medieval world really was.
He's like a reminder that history is full of these hidden gems, just waiting for us to dig them up and uncover their secrets. And who knows, maybe someone out there is cracking a code right now that will totally change how we see Cyfeilliog's life and times. Until then, we'll keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the fascinating world of early medieval Wales. So that's our deep dive into the enigmatic Cyfeilliog, a Welsh bishop who navigated Viking raids, royal politics, and even left us a coded message. We hope you enjoyed unraveling this historical mystery with us. Until next time, keep exploring.